See, the US reached peak oil back in the 70s, yet it continued to consume at an increasing pace. Now, how it is possible that a society that cannot expand the amount of energy it uses to produce excess capacity can continue growing consumption? In part, it is due to the country tapping into the savings from previous decades. In part, due to some other resources still having excess capacity, but also it is due to the United States trading with and borrowing from the rest of the world. What has it been borrowing? Energy, clothes, metals, all sorts of things. In turn, it offered the world treasury notes that represented future promises of services and labor. See, what's happening here, described in terms of the example I already gave above, would be like Prudence the baker not borrowing money from the bank to buy more land and hire help. See, the truth about Prudence is she can't really do this since she already got more debt than she can afford getting an option or mortgage on her home. So she has this absolutely fantastic idea of borrowing additional loaves of bread from her neighbor Colin to sell at her bakery. In return, she decides to pay Colin by issuing a bond obligation, the interest in which is a fraction of what his contribution was worth. This allows her to borrow, say, 30 loaves a day, while paying Colin the equivalent of what one loaf would roughly sell for in interest. She doesn't save the money generated by this revenue, of course, who would do that? Instead, she gets a second home with another option. Or she buys a new car, she gets an iPhone, she gets all kinds of new clothes, and most importantly, she goes to nightclubs in the hope of meeting that special someone. At the beginning, such a system works fine, as the interest is small and revenues increase due to inflation generated by the improving standard of living of everyone like Prudence in the country. Because people are buying more, because they're borrowing from their neighbors like Colin, they have this temporary wealth that they can use to spend. And Prudence can now charge more for bread because more bread is getting consumed, while her past obligations to Colin remain the same. But eventually, Prudence will reach a point where, despite this inflationary gap between what she borrows at and what she sells for, almost all of her revenue will be going towards the repayment of interest to Colin. That is, all the bread she bakes and borrows from Colin would need to be sold, and the monetary proceeds need to be given back to Colin as interest. Now, let's complicate this a bit, and let's say that Prudence also works for the government and has a money printing machine, and she decides, hey, why don't I just print up the money to pay for my bond obligation to Colin and keep the revenue for my bakery for myself? Well, that's a great idea. For a time, everything is absolutely fine, but then Colin, that sneaky Colin catches up to what is actually happening and realizes that he's giving Prudence real assets in exchange for worthless paper. See, foreigners like Prudence's neighbor Colin used to hold a lot of treasuries with long-term maturity dates 20, 30 years into the future. Now, they've sold most of these, but they've cashed into short-term treasuries with maturity dates of 2 to 7 years into the future. Now, we gotta ask ourselves the question, if the United States keeps printing, what do you think is going to happen? Probably foreigners are going to sell their short-term treasury promises and cash them in for assets like land and agricultural products. They would also have to stimulate demand at home by teaching their frugal, productive populations that in fact it is time for them to spend their way to prosperity, and that if they go out and consume all the products that they produce themselves, not only would they be wealthier, but they would also be independent from the United States of America. And under such circumstances, what would happen to the US? Well, first, there would be less goods in the US due to lack of imports. Second, there would be even less goods in the US because foreigners would have used some of their dollars to purchase goods and commodities in the US that they can use at home. And third, due to lack of imports of such products as oil and metals, there would be severely limited ability to ramp up production of goods in this country. There would be shortages. The workforce would be cut short by the unemployment because unemployment would be picking up as exports would be getting into trouble. Why would exports be getting into trouble? Well, if nobody wants to give us imports, why would they need exports? So there would be less things to go around among people who would be making less money. This would result in a lower standard of living. Will inflation be happening? Depends on how you define it. Some goods will definitely become more expensive, especially those heavily imported as well as limited resources. This does not mean that inflation will be happening in the stock market as a whole, since most people would be struggling to find enough work because services will not be in high demand, and most people will lack the skills to produce. Also, think about it this way. Most banks would be out of business, as would a lot of other companies were inflation rampant in this environment, because you can't lend against a future of growth when the future is contracting. And if the rate at which money is created by the government exceeds the rate at which this money is being lended out by the banks, they're essentially going bankrupt in real terms. So, if the government tries very hard, wouldn't it be so great if our houses could be worth more in dollar terms? Well, it's possible to achieve, but you can keep in mind that those same houses, they would be worth less in sausage or cereal terms, since the supply of houses is likely to remain constant while the supply of sausages dwindles. We're not there yet. We can probably still turn back, though it's a tough one at this point, especially despite our history, because we blew a bubble in tech in 2000, and instead of cutting back to a level of spending we could afford, we blew a bubble in real estate. Once this imploded, we refused to cut back once again, and now we're blowing a bubble on an international level in the bond market. If things don't change, you can bet this too is going to implode. So, the next time someone tells you that we can inflate our way out of this crisis, you should know that they probably don't have a clue as to what this implies. Deflation in all sectors would be a painful blow to take, and it would likely be a long time before we could recover and find a path to sustainability. But inflation is likely to put an end to capitalism, imperialism, and fail to restructure the economy in time for most people to keep a reasonably affluent lifestyle for most people in this country. See, as long as the United States is going to try and continue business as usual, with an extremely oversized service sector and an extremely outdated production sector, as well as widespread unemployment, overpriced medicine, overpriced education, the bubble will keep bursting again and again and again. This is because people will not get a full understanding of the problem and will not grasp the nature of the real changes that need to happen in order for a solution to be found. A deflationary spiral would hurt. People here are not used to cutting back. We need to remember that the consumption rate of one US citizen is 42 times that of a citizen of Kenya. If you don't think that's impressive, I'll put it in other words. The US consumption rate would remain the same if it was populated by 13 billion Kenyans. 13 billion! And we think overpopulation is happening in Africa? Seriously, this is unsustainable. Even if we pretend that a timely transition into nanosolar, clean coal, efficient recycling, and soil use non-corn-based ethanol is still possible, it's unsustainable. But deflation has more benefits. Employment would pick up sooner. The environment would begin to recover. Universal health care could become a reality. The United States would still have enough knowledge and goods to be a prosperous country. It is no longer possible to spend our way to prosperity. Let's use this time to prepare for a different future. After all, a future of saving and producing is better than no future at all.